All right. So it's good to be back with you again. And today it's my sincere hope that I will finish a kind of mini lecture series, not really intended, but it turned out that way, on the 2020 elections and try to put the elections in context by thinking about partisan polarization. And to be alliterative, I want to talk also about political paralysis that I think the polarization is generating, and then the consequences as we now enter a new phase in the pandemic for our capacity as a society and a country to cope with what the coronavirus is doing to us in terms of public health and economics in particular. And so the big question has been, did 2020 in fact deepen the partisan divide? And the answer to that, which I will return to in a moment, is I believe it in fact has. And then the second and perhaps more important constructive question is there anything we can do about it? And in order to answer that question, we need to have a clear sense both of what 2020 did to us in terms of partisanship and the deeper structural roots and whether or not those roots can be overcome. So I will start, as I have been starting in every lecture, with a brief update on what's happening with the pandemic. And the news is uneven. On the one hand, as you can see, this is yesterday's data. It would be, I think, even a little bit worse if I were to share today's data with you. We are in the midst of a terrible moment in the history of the pandemic, and we've now exceeded 3,000 casualties in a day, making the coronavirus the third most lethal event in American history. There is a storm as well as a battle during the Civil War that killed more people. But at this point, the single day fatality from the coronavirus has exceeded Pearl Harbor and September 11th, 9/11, September 11th, 2001. Sorry, and so the of course, cumulative casualties. It's not a single day event. This is going to go on for more than a year. And until we bring the casualties under control, this is going to continue to be a truly painful, awful event in American history. And one of the things we're seeing, and again, this is yesterday's data, but I'm comparing it with a week ago, the last data I showed you, it is an intensification of the rates of transmission, hospitalization, and casualties on a nationwide basis. And if you're paying attention week by week, you will see that in the Southwest and in the Midwest into the Northeast, in areas in the South as well, the rate of transmission is intensifying. The darker the color, the more cases per 100,000. And last time I showed you this event, that the dark red was concentrated primarily in the Dakotas and Minnesota and the west of Texas, and it's really spread. And obviously you can see many places in Central California as well. And again, there's not yet any indication that we're getting this under control. And so unfortunately, I think we should anticipate that the areas in the country being overwhelmed by the virus will continue to multiply as this surge goes on. And I don't know what stops this surge. On the one hand, we have the good news. I'll get to that in just a moment, that Pfizer's vaccine has been approved for distribution. The Moderna vaccine will probably be approved soon. And so in a sense, some relief is in sight from this, but it's going to take quite a while. And I'll get into the implications of polarization and polarized attitudes on the vaccine for its distribution in a moment. But I want to share a different graphic with you today than I've shared with you in the past. And this is an indication of ICU capacity. And as you can see, the lighter colors indicate 70 to 75% ICU capacity. The darker colors at 90 to 95% ICU capacity. And this is obviously a patchwork, but what you're seeing is that there are substantial regions of the United States where ICU capacity is 85% or higher. And as you know, this is the threshold that Governor Newsom in California has given for lockdowns in the state. And I think the reason is quite simple. Once you reach 85% capacity, not only do you anticipate that you will move very quickly close to 100% or even exceeding the capacity of your hospital system, but it's also the case that hospitals then start performing what I would call proactive triaging, which is to say, not allowing people who in other circumstances would be hospitalized into the hospitals in order to reserve space for those who are most ill. And this is obviously not what we need in order to minimize casualties. We need people to be able to receive intensive care support. The lethality of the disease, the number of people who are dying from it, has gone down, and that is because our therapeutics have gotten better. In order to really gain access to those therapeutics, you need intensive medical treatment. For that to be the case, the medical care infrastructure needs to have capacity for the patients with the most urgent needs. And what this diagram shows is there are increasingly broad swaths of the United States where that is going to be a challenge or increasingly difficult to do. So, from the grim news to the better news. This is the rate of survival, or I should say really the rate of contraction of COVID-19 with the Pfizer vaccine. The vaccine that was approved for distribution last night is actually beginning to be distributed today and tomorrow. And as you can see, a week after the first dose, there is a substantial discrepancy between those who received the placebo and those who actually received the vaccine. And essentially, the vaccine is, as we've learned, about 95% effective in preventing people from contracting the disease. And so the good news is that this vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, the two that have completed phase 3 trials, are very effective. It's going to be a logistical struggle to distribute them. And this struggle is going to be made worse by the fact that the medical health infrastructure of our society is occupied with treating the pandemic as opposed to merely administering the vaccine. It's a huge undertaking to administer the flu vaccine on an annual basis. This vaccine requires 2 doses. The Pfizer version of it requires refrigeration at extreme temperatures. There aren't yet enough doses to get the 60 to 70% of the population vaccinated. We hope that by the second half of the year, there will be more vaccines approved and more supply. But in the first half of the year, it is going to be scarce and it is going to be rationed. And so that's the logistical struggle here. It would be difficult even if we weren't in the grips of the worst pandemic in the century. The fact that we are in the grips of it is going to make it even more difficult. But that does not mean these are insurmountable difficulties. These are difficulties that we will navigate. They just will be challenges, and we need to be patient as we face those challenges. Having said all of that, the critical issue here really is going to be how many of us take the vaccine. And what we can see when we look at the attitudes that the public has when they respond to surveys is that it turns out that only about a third of us are extremely confident that the vaccine has been fairly tested. And another 40% of us, so getting up to about 2/3 total, are somewhat confident. Similarly, we're not altogether confident that it will be distributed fairly or
Hi,
quickly
Elizabeth.
and safely.
I've got, it's Marion calling. Of having computer trouble, and I'm on.
Sorry, I obviously didn't have everybody muted. I took care of that. And so there's a general question with roughly a third of the population not confident that the vaccine is safe, and another 40% only somewhat confident. How likely are we to actually take the vaccine? And as I've said, the public health officials are a little bit on the fence in terms of what proportion of the population needs to be vaccinated in order for the pandemic to be brought under control, in order for transmission to become much less widespread. The issue here is one of around 10%. Is it 60% of the population or 70% of the population? But when we ask who will get the coronavirus, less than 50% says yes, for sure they will. There's another, right, almost 30%. So again, we get up to about 2/3 very quickly, who says they're not sure. And then there's nearly 30%. And so please note, if we need to get to 70% to attain what's sometimes called herd immunity, in other words, for the virus to then not be able to jump person to person as soon as people start to gather without masks and distance, then basically everybody who's on the fence needs to come round to taking the virus. And this is obviously a big obstacle in public persuasion, public health, political leadership, religious leaders, business leaders, community leaders, in addition to politicians and public health officials, are going to have to try very hard to convince a skeptical public that this is essential to their own health, to the economic health of our society, to protecting the vulnerable among us. And as we can see, there are some big disparities with regards to gender. I'm going to talk more about this in a few minutes, but as you can see, more men say that they will for sure get the vaccine than women say that they will. This is interesting. I'll get into this in a few minutes. More people who are older say that they will get the vaccine, and more people who are white say that they will get the vaccine. By the way, there is a striking discrepancy here, and one that I think we're really going to have to think about as we go forward into the vaccine era of the pandemic, which is that African Americans have suffered among the highest rates of fatality from the vaccine. That's related to their underlying health issues, related to their incapacity to work from home and their living conditions. And yet, only about a quarter of African Americans say that at this point that they will get the coronavirus vaccine. And you can see the number 40% saying that they will not get the vaccine is higher than for any other demographic group, right? And of course, we have a history of not only unfair distribution of medical care, but racial experimentation, exposing African Americans to syphilis deliberately, etc. Right, and so there's an understandable skepticism on the part of African Americans to the public health establishment in the United States. Nevertheless, and I'll get into this in a moment, I do believe that we should be confident in this vaccine. I think that there are reasons to have a degree of skepticism about putting something that has been engineered genetically into our bodies. But I also believe that those grounds for skepticism can and should be overcome in this case. It's not enough to have a kind of generalized skepticism about this kind of research in a situation in which thousands of people are dying a day. Right, and so I do basically believe the research that indicates that this is safe and effective, but we have to overcome the skepticism in our population in order for it to actually be effective for us as a population. Again, when we look at this broken down, gender, race, age, you can see the disparities that were already present in the previous data set. This is a different survey. This one is done by Pew. The previous survey was an AP survey, and I'll show you the results from one more survey as well. But what you see here also is disparities by education. And I do think the fact that this gives us a little bit more of a time frame, that confidence is going up across the board. We can hope that this trend line will continue, that as more and more people take the vaccine, as we see, I hope what we will see, which is very few side effects, as we see immunity developing, there are things still to be discovered. For instance, will the virus itself mutate? Will the vaccine stay effective for 6 months or a year? There is genuine uncertainty about aspects of this, but I hope that we will see confidence-inspiring results, and that the result may be that all of these numbers will go up. So as you can see, if you have postgraduate education, if you have college education, it's quite likely that you're going to take the vaccine. On the other hand, if you have a high school or less, or some college, those numbers basically completely intersect. Much less likely, 45% of the people say they won't do it. And there's a huge partisan discrepancy here. And this is where I'll focus more today. In addition to there being an income discrepancy, there's probably overlap between the education and the income groups here. But the fact that basically 70% of Democrats are going to take this, and it looks like at present 50% of Republicans may not take the vaccine, creates a huge discrepancy, another feature of partisan polarization in our society. And to just concentrate on this feature for a moment, you can see that there's been a lasting discrepancy in partisan attitudes about a vaccine going all the way back to the middle of the summer. And interestingly, right, the fact that the president took the vaccine, I'm sorry, I take that back. I'm obviously confused for a moment there. The fact that the president survived the coronavirus did not budge partisan opinion about this at all. We will have to see. I believe that the president will take, not President Donald Trump, will take the vaccine. I believe that he wants credit for having developed it. I believe he will try to persuade his base to take it. And we will have to see whether or not that budges these numbers. But for now, there's this very strong partisan discrepancy in attitudes, with Democrats generally indicating 3/4 of them will take the vaccine. Republicans split 50-50 down the middle. All right, so I want to shift from the vaccine to a more general discussion of partisanship. Obviously, if we remain polarized on the question of whether or not to take the vaccine will have limited efficacy as a result. And so this is one urgent place where we have to, I hope, begin to come together. But it's got to be more than a hope. We've got to figure out how we do that. And that's where the analysis of the structural roots of polarization come in. So let me now talk a little bit more about masculinity. And one of the striking features of the exit polling that's coming out, and I will just say again, as I've said to you in the past, the exit polling is even less reliable this year than it's been in the past due to the pandemic, and then our inability to get as much polling information as we would like. And so we will have to take this with a grain of salt until we get more information. But this is, I think, a really interesting thing to look at. Men who identify as completely masculine, this is a category that essentially is left up to the answerer of the poll, the respondent, to make their determination. What do you mean by completely masculine? But if you identify as completely masculine, you're much more likely to approve of Donald Trump than are people in general, or men who identify as less masculine, or women who identify as completely or less feminine, right? So similarly, you're inclined to think that Trump has a strategy for coping with the coronavirus. If you are completely masculine, much more so, right? A 20% differential from the population as a whole. So attitudes about masculinity are driving some of the polarization in our society. And I'll get into this a little bit more deeply here. I want to start with a diagram I've shared with you before, but to put it into the context of a discussion of masculinity. And what we see here is two different ways of measuring this, but basically 30, 40, 50% of the population has almost no savings, right? By the time we get up to $1,000, we're talking about almost 70% of the population having less than $1,000 in savings, right? And this is then a economy without shock absorbers, as Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, put it. But I want to refract this issue that so many families have so little savings through now the lens of masculinity and the idea of what it means to be a breadwinner, right? Because it's central to the late 20th, early 21st century American conception of masculinity, that the man is economically responsible for the well-being of the family. This has shifted a little bit among those people who consider themselves perhaps to be less masculine. But I would note to you, and we're seeing this in the context of the pandemic, statistics indicate that roughly 90% of domestic labor is done in our society by women still, childcare labor especially. And what this means is that men go out into the labor force and take primary economic responsibility for their families. This may be, to varying degrees, economically rational. Men still earn more than women, but it's clearly also cultural or part of our gendered identities, that this is what makes a man, makes a man a contributing member of society, shores up his authority in the family, allows them to fulfill their duties as husband, father, etc. Right? And what this diagram indicates is that it's awfully hard for many men to fulfill this role adequately right now. And the idea that men would have to stay at home, not work, when they have so little savings, when their family depends on them, has been very difficult to accept on the part of those people, those family, those men in particular, who have so little savings that it will be exhausted within a year. And I'm going to get into economic policy in a moment, but it does seem to me that these things are tightly connected. And so when we think about whether or not people are going to follow the public health directives, they will be, I hope, I assume, much less ambiguous a month or so from now when Joe Biden is president. He will almost certainly try to impose a national mask mandate, objective federal regulations on when lockdowns have to occur based on rates of transmission or ICU capacity, et cetera. Some of the stuff that has been adopted primarily in states in which Democrats are in charge will be rolled out as national standards. There will be court challenges. It's not clear that it will survive, but I also want to point out to you that irrespective of whether it's upheld as policy, it will not be routinely enforced. We simply do not live in that kind of society where people will be going house to house in order to determine whether or not people are having large indoor gatherings. You know, in the breach, there may be some enforcement, but we should be thankful in a sense that our cultural mores of privacy and liberty do not allow for a kind of authoritarian policing of the kind you might see in a society like China, which has done much better in getting the pandemic under control, in part because there is no libertarian streak within the culture preventing the state from regulating personal conduct. Now, if we are going to succeed in doing this in the United States in 2021, we're going to have to make the men who are economically responsible for their families and who have very little savings feel that they can stay home when the virus is raging in their area without endangering their family. What does that mean? That means we need to extend supplemental unemployment benefits and to have in place the infrastructure, the bureaucracy with which to get those benefits quickly and easily to those who need them. And I will just point out to you that this is not just economic. Obviously, there's a public health side to it, there's an economic side to it, there is also a psychological side to it. And I find this to be very interesting. This is in part an examination of whether or not polling is adequately capturing Trump voters, in part because people who are socially alienated or disconnected do not answer polls at the same rate as people who feel more socially integrated. But it also speaks to what Ann Case and Angus Deaton, in their important study on deaths of despair, refer to as the psychological consequences of the disappearance of good work, stable, unionized manufacturing work over the last 50 years in large regions of the United States. And that is that the work was not just the source of income, it was also the pillar of social inclusion for the people who did the work. And what we're seeing is that for people who feel cut off, right? They've lost their job. Maybe they're driving an Uber or working at an Amazon fulfillment center. These are not jobs that create social connections, right? They feel embarrassed about their new economic vulnerability. And so maybe they stop going to church, they stop participating in baseball or bowling leagues. They end up socially disconnected. This increases the likelihood, among other things, that they're going to abuse alcohol or drugs or, unfortunately, other members of their family. It also increases the likelihood that they are voting for Trump based on the limited data that we have coming out of 2020. And so, again, trying to get a complete picture of some of the sources of polarization and where it is coming from and what it is doing to our capacity to battle the coronavirus. Let me share with you again a diagram I've shared with you before. This is about mistrust in the election outcome. And in addition to the news of last night that the Pfizer vaccine has been approved for distribution, we also got another big piece of news, which is that the Texas gambit with the Supreme Court, asking the Supreme Court to overturn election results in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Georgia and in other states, right, was rejected by the Supreme Court. Last major legal challenge that the Trump administration will be able to, or I should say the Trump campaign will be able to mount to the certification of the 2020 election results. And please note that the Electoral College will vote on Monday, right? And so there's an inexorability about Joe Biden's victory in this campaign. Having said that, it's worthwhile noting, right, that 17 state attorney generals and hundreds of Republican members of Congress joined Texas in this outlandish suit. And I think it has to be said, both the legal theory that Texas has the right to demand that the Supreme Court invalidate the electoral results of other states, as well as the statistical evidence that was used in that brief in order to try to demonstrate problems with the vote, they lack completely and utterly in credibility as legal and statistical arguments. And yet, it is the case that elected officials in many states signed on to Texas's argument, as did many members, Republican members of the House of Representatives. I'm put in mind of Alexis de Tocqueville, who in Democracy in America credits the culture of the legal profession. The idea that they have a fidelity to the rule of law and the Constitution that is part of their professional ethics, just something that is drilled into them in law school and part of their, if you will, professional respectability. And that it appears that in 21st century America, that culture, the culture of legal ethics and commitment to the Constitution and the rule of law, have been completely overridden by a different culture. And that is a culture of Republican partisanship. And so I'm going to be a little bit philosophical about this for a moment. You can ask, where does culture, especially political and civic culture, come from? And there I think you want to say it's different institutions and organizations that inculcate culture via spreading norms and orientations and making them seem simply common sense to those who belong to the organization. And that in American politics, political parties have been one of the extremely important sources of shared political beliefs. and that over the last couple of decades, the Republican Party has increasingly become a propagator of culture in a way that undermines fidelity to the Constitution and the rule of law in favor of simple strategic considerations. And so when we think about polarization and these results, right, and I hope this is not accurate, I hope this will change over time, but what people are saying in mid-November when they answer surveys, 75% of Republicans are saying that they do not have confidence in the result of the election. And of course, the result of this will be that Joe Biden will enter the presidency with extremely diminished legitimacy, right? There will be a significant portion of the population who believes that he did not win the election in a fair and transparent way. And that will certainly make it difficult for him to govern, certainly make it difficult for Republican elected officials to in any way cooperate with this administration. And I want to be clear, right, that the forces pushing Republican officials to disregard fidelity to the rule of law, fidelity to the Constitution, standard legal arguments, or even the obvious facts, right? And it's worthwhile noting that a significant fraction of these officials are signing on to arguments that say that the elections in which they got their offices were not conducted fairly or transparently, that they were stolen, even though they resulted in their election, right? That this is, in a sense, a bold-faced lack of consistency on their part. That this is because of the deep hold that Donald Trump has on the Republican Party right now, his unwillingness to acknowledge the truth of his defeat, and the fear that these elected officials have, that if they do not fall in line with Trump in denying in whatever way possible that the outcome of the election couldn't be a Biden victory, that they will then be subject to a primary challenge 2 years or 4 years from now, and that they will be replaced by someone who is, quote, Trumpier than they are. Now, this then gets us to part of, I think, what we need to be very concerned about at this moment, which is the circulation of false news in our current political and media systems. And this is news that the coronavirus isn't real, that the vaccine is dangerous, or that Donald Trump actually won the election but for mischief, foreign intervention, or outright fraud, right? And this is a diagram. I won't go into the details of it, but I want to point out to you, right, that this is from Yeshai Bankler and his co-authors' work, Networked Propaganda. I've given you whole lectures on this in the past, that the media ecosystem on the right is a propaganda feedback loop system, right? And part of what we're seeing is that as Fox News refuses to be sufficiently supine in simply saying what Trump believes, Trump is increasingly directing his followers to other outlets, and Fox's ratings are suffering as a result. But in particular, right, this is a feedback loop in which the public, or a segment of the public, right, that those who are inclined to support Trump, demand identity confirmation from both the media and the politicians, demand to live in a world in which Donald Trump couldn't honestly lose an election, in which they can't possibly not go to work, without endangering their family members. And that in part what is going on here, and again, I do want to give you more information, but I want to try to hit the forest before we get into the trees, is that more and more members of the public who belong to the right-wing media system are so fragile in their identities that they seek confirmation at all costs, even if that endangers them, endangers their family members, endangers their society, even if this involves obvious departures from the truth. And that we are seeing this again in 2020, perhaps in the worst form that we've seen it yet in our society. And that fragility is rooted in social isolation, in economic vulnerability, in conceptions of masculinity that really are not supported by the economy of a post-industrial society. All right, so questions that this analysis leaves us with. And I'm going to start with the obvious. What will happen in Georgia? And I have to tell you, I'm not sharing the polls with you because I don't put a lot of stock in the polls right now. The polls actually show the Democrats with a narrow lead. You will remember, of course, that there are not one but two separate runoff elections occurring in Georgia. And were the Democrats to win both of them, this is, of course, for the Senate, they would control the Senate. Were they to lose one of them, they will then lose control of the Senate. So it's a very peculiar circumstance, the same state having two runoff elections at the same time, and the outcome of those elections determining control of the Senate. I'll just note in passing, I have no crystal ball. I have no idea what will actually happen in early January in Georgia. It doesn't seem to me to be that likely that the Democrats will win both of these seats. We will have to see. But in a sense, one of the main motives that got Democrats to come out and vote was an anti-Trump motive. Without Trump on the ballot, that may diminish Democrat turnout. We'll have to see if it also has a similar effect on Republican turnout. It's really hard to predict, and I'm not going to try to predict. But obviously, this is one of the big questions. But assuming that either the Democrats don't gain control of the Senate, or even if the lightning strikes twice in Georgia and they do, that their control of the Senate will be incredibly fragile, right? One Democratic defection, and they will have lost control of the Senate. The question then is, will Biden try to work with the Republicans? Will he try to govern from the center and to find issues on which there could be bipartisan cooperation? And the concomitant question with this is, will Republicans stay with Trumpism for the next 2 to 4 years? And the reason I say these two questions go together is, of course, whether or not Biden can work with the Republicans depends in part on whether or not the Republicans are willing to work with Biden. And if we've got Trump in the wings indicating that Biden is not a legitimate president, stole the office from him, it's highly unlikely that the Republicans will work with Biden. And I'll just say to you very quickly that for most of the 21st century, the Republicans have been a party of opposition. And in a sense, they're very comfortable in that place, right? Donald Trump tells us that he's got a better plan once Obamacare is overturned, but he won't tell us what it is, right? And frankly, nobody really believes that he has any concrete ideas. The Republican Party has been and remains much more comfortable opposing Democratic legislative efforts than actually governing themselves. And so in a sense, I anticipate that the Republicans will fall back to form, both because Trump will remain extremely powerful within their base, and so a power broker, and he will demand non-cooperation. And because this is a kind of standard fallback position for the Republican Party. Will any Republicans break ranks? Will Romney or Collins or McCloskey of Alaska? And in part, we've seen some of this already, right? The military appropriation bill passed over Trump's objections. And there was very little support in the Senate for the Texas Supreme Court suit, right? And so there's some indication perhaps that the Republican senators are obeying a slightly different partisan dynamic, and that it might just be possible for Biden to stitch together a narrow governing majority if Romney or Collins or others are willing to work with him. But I have to say, again, I don't hold out a lot of hope for this. Given everything I've just canvassed, the electorate of the Republican Party, who ultimately the Republican senators remain accountable to, is deeply skeptical of Biden, deeply hostile to the Democrats. And so there's just not going to be a lot of room for Republicans to maneuver away from McConnell and their party's position. Please note that in Utah, Trump's vote went up in 2020, and Romney is obviously sensitive to that. Is Republican obstruction good politics? And I'm about to get into the economics here for a moment, but I will share some more information with you on this soon. We are in desperate need, I've already indicated, for simple public health reasons so that people can safely stay at home, but also because the economy is clearly losing jobs. And with the vaccine now approved and ready for distribution, at least in a limited way, we can anticipate that we may start to recover in the second half of 2021. How quick that recovery is, how broad spread the wealth that's generated will be, how fair, how quickly it makes its way down to the bottom 50% of the population who's paid the major consequences of the pandemic-induced contraction. All of that will depend on what we do legislatively over the next 6 months. If we can sustain consumer spending, if we can keep employees who are temporarily out of work on the payrolls with their companies by supporting their company's ability to pay them through governmental loans and grants, this will allow our economy to bounce back. However, it will also be legislative victories for Joe Biden. It means that during a Biden presidency, the economy may recover. Will the Republican Party decide that it is bad politics to give Biden legislative victories that perhaps pave the way to economic recovery during his presidency? The fact that I can pose that as a question indicates the depth of destructiveness of partisan polarization in 2020, 2021. The idea that the Republicans might do things that will clearly damage their constituents and damage the country as a whole for partisan advantage. Let me say more directly, the fact that I think it's likely that this will happen, the fact that we don't have legislation right now, that the odds of even a modest recovery bill making its way out of the House and Senate in the next few weeks. The fact that so many Americans stand, as I've shown you, on the edge of an unemployment cutoff cliff, and we're not legislating with clear emergent urgency is indicative of just how paralytic partisan polarization is in the 21st century. And I do believe, in ways that I will try to redeem to you, that this is asymmetrical, that the Republicans are much more interested in preventing legislation that would be good for the nation than are Democrats. And then finally, how can Joe Biden and the Democrats succeed in making the Republicans accountable if they engage in obstructionism? And I'm starting to read Barack Obama's memoir of his first period as president. And one of the things I think that is obvious as we read this is that the Obama administration and Obama himself was reluctant to punish Republicans for obstructionism, did not discover a viable political strategy for holding Republicans to account with their own constituents for their failures of leadership. So that one of the things that it seems is incumbent upon Joe Biden, who I think dispositionally is not suited to this role, is going to be to discover ways of making the Republicans pay the price for obstruction should they set down this path, which I think is all but inevitable. All right, so let me stop there for a few minutes and take some questions. You will have noticed that I have not spoken with you at all about Michael Tomasky today. I seem to have this penchant for biting off a little bit more than I can chew. I will do my best to round out the discussion of Tomasky soon, but why don't I stop there for now? Who would like to start us out with a question or thoughts or comments? And I can see that Flossie got her hand up right away. Go ahead, please. I'm unmuting everyone. Try to keep your background noise down if you can, and give me just a moment to do that. And then Flossie, you will have to hold your spacebar down as well. Go ahead. I can't hear you, Flossie. Are you talking? Flossie, are you holding your spacebar down?
There I am.
There we go. Okay, go ahead. No. It's not working. It worked for a moment. Now it's not working again.
How about now?
Now it's working.
Okay, I keep my space bar down.
Yes, you've got to hold it down.
Let me pick up on Michael Tomasky, who had some ideas about what we can do to bring peace on earth. For example, he is telling us to go back to teaching civics and picking up on civics, which became the most boring class that you could take in high school. He wants us to go back to teaching civics. And he also wants us to use a technique that Philip Roth discussed with great disparagement in the Plot Against America, that kids from Manhattan should go and live with Midwestern families and farm and work hard, but that the Midwestern families didn't have to go to Manhattan to see what it was like to live in the slum. So these things may work, but very slowly. I think what we need are history teachers who can retell the story of American history and make it a story, make it a good narrative, and bring in some excellent movies or excellent documentaries to help them out. I also think we need men and women like Oprah and Denzel Washington and some of our great and respected Black actors and maybe a few respected athletes on both sides to talk to us and to talk to all of us and to be sponsored by legitimate products rather than cars. I think we have to believe in teaching history again, and in protecting the consumer again.
Yeah, thank you, Flossie. And obviously you're doing your homework and I'm not giving the lecture I'm supposed to be giving. I did have the slide, and so I'm going to show you very quickly. This is part of what Flossie is referring to, right? And so Tomasky in his book, if we can keep it, divides his recommendation into political fixes and social and cultural fixes. And Flossie is emphasizing the social and cultural fixes. And the social and cultural fixes include, as she's mentioned, as Tomasky puts it, vastly expanding civics education, so that it starts maybe in 5th grade and goes all the way through 12th grade. And, you know, I do have to say, Flossie, one of the questions we run up against here is who's teaching the kids, right? And so if all the teachers are committed to a program of multicultural inclusion and civic education for understanding the other side and deliberation, then we're in pretty good shape. But as we know, many red states have engaged in the politics of education precisely to inhibit or prevent teachers from having the resources of doing that kind of education, right? And, you know, the fact of the matter is that there are differences in red state educators and blue state educators. And so we can't just expect our educators to do work unless there's a bigger national project. Now, Flossie also refers to the idea that we do exchange programs with college students, that we have a year of service, perhaps replacing the 4th year of education, that we do high school exchange programs in addition to college exchange programs, and that large national employers do exchange programs as well. That these are 4 interrelated proposals for overcoming geographic isolation. Now, I have to say I'm a little disappointed in Tomasky in that he doesn't do what seems to me very obvious proposal that affluent coastal cities create more affordable housing. Because frankly, part of what keeps people from the heartland in the heartland is the incapacity to afford the cost of living in the coastal cities. And so rather than these artificial exchange programs, create opportunity for people to actually move to the coast. And I'll just point out very quickly, and I'm going to lecture at greater length on this, there are also political fixes. And I have to say, number 7, given everything I've spoken with you about today, revive moderate republicanism. And I wanted to say a minute more about what this means on Tomasky's account. The idea he has in mind here is that a consortium of billionaires, and I think he's thinking of Bloomberg in particular, start funding moderate Republicans so that Republicans that do not fall in line with Trump and McConnell and their ilk have the capacity to actually survive the inevitable primary challenge that results. And his idea is that eventually there might be 10 or 20 or 30 Republicans who do not simply fall in line with the House caucus, who are willing to work with the Democrats as well. And if so, then we might have a less recalcitrant partisanship on the part of the Republican Party going forward. I can see, John, you've got your hand up. Please go ahead. Give me a moment. I'm just unmuting everyone again because we were getting some background noise. You'll have to hold your space bar down.
Ruth, my wife, just pointed out to me that Peggy Noonan last week had a column in the Wall Street Journal about Margaret Chase Smith. Very, very good column. And this morning, her column is telling that she has Mrs. Smith's tips for new lawmakers. And I'm sure she mostly has Republicans in mind, but just to read a few of them. Know what you're about and say it. If you want to be believed, say it straight. Your state is more than a platform for your rise. Don't abandon the middle ground, which actually exists. Understand you won't always be appreciated, and people need concrete help. Those are very good bywords, and anybody intelligent should, well-meaning and intelligent, both should accept them. Peggy Noonan is one of the smartest Republicans around, and she's always worth reading. But this column is, if anybody here at PG wants it, I'll send it to them if they don't get the journal. But
I'll take it, John. And just by way of background, Margaret Chase Smith, of course, was the great Maine Republican senator, the exemplar of a kind of moderate or liberal Republican, served in the 1980s and 1990s, if memory serves. John, you might have the precise dates, but
earlier than that.
Earlier than that, okay. Okay.
70s and 80s.
Yeah, I guess that's right. By then, moderate Republicanism was on the way out. But yes, so as smart as Peggy Noonan is, I'm concerned that the forces that are producing partisan polarization and extremism, and I do think it's important to see that this is asymmetrical or unilateral. It's really coming from the right, and I have been talking with you about them for weeks. You know, whether it's the distribution of economic vulnerability or resentment against globalist elites, that those forces are structural, and so let me speak for a moment about another op-ed that I was looking at earlier this week, and Tim Wu, who I've spoken with you about before, an interesting Columbia University law professor, the guy who gave us the phrase net neutrality, among other things, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times in which he said, look, the reason Trump was not able to consolidate authoritarian rule in the United States was not Madisonian checks and balances. As it turns out, the Senate fell in line with Donald Trump. And so he was in important respects unchecked. And the judiciary was uneven in its capacity to check him. The real reason that Trump was not able to get away with following his authoritarian instincts on so many issues had to do with the military and people in the Department of Justice and other civil servants and their sense of professional ethics, especially Republican elected officials in swing states who stood up and said, I may not like it, but I know what the outcome in this election was, and I'm going to certify it. Right? Or people in the Department of Justice who refused to go after Biden, despite the fact that they were getting tremendous pressure from Donald Trump and perhaps also William Barr. And so we've got to look to where the moderating influences in our society are coming from. They're not coming from the Republican Party right now, for the most part. They're certainly not coming from Republican elected officials. And as much as I wish the incoming congressional class were to circulate Noonan's op-ed and take it to heart, I think the reason the Republicans are not doing that, the reason the Republicans are instead falling in line with Trump, is structural. It's not just that they've lost their sense of ethics. And so until we change the structures, we're not going to change the forces producing hyperpartisanship and asymmetrical polarization right now.
Until then, we'll just have to rely on the deep state.
Exactly. Yes, and hope that we bolster it. I mean, to be honest, the chicken and egg problem here is that good policy might undo some of the structural forces, but in our constitutional system, it's really hard for one party to govern on its own. We'll have to see if Biden has the dexterity, the nimbleness, the authority, the capacity to bully as well, that would be necessary to get a very narrow Democratic majority, if he has one, to do the work it needs to do to begin to break some of the log jams, to put in place policies that might make middle America a little bit less vulnerable and easily mobilized on the right. All right, everyone. Great being able to spend time with you again. And we will finish this off one week or another. I'll stop making promises. But Flossie, keep pushing me. Ruth, were you going to say something?
Just a commercial break. I'd like to remind everyone that we have the jewelry sale today and tomorrow. And please, we're waiting for your calls. And if you want a Hanukkah gift, this is a very nice Jewish star necklace for your daughters or granddaughters. Thank you.
Very nice, Ruth. Ruth, did you send that letter you showed me? The letter you composed?
Which letter?
To a letter to a Republican.
I sent it, yeah, but I got no response.
You got no response. Okay. I've been curious getting to see you to hear how that went. All right. Sorry.
But most of my letters get no responses, so I'm not worried.
Yeah, including yours truly. Sorry about that. All right, everybody. Take care. See you next week. Keep being smart and safe.
Thank you, David.
Oh, thank you. Bye, guys.
Bye.